Coming up, a seismic shift in the NFL landscape that leads me to pose a very intriguing question to Andrew Makowitz right after the theme music. Yes, sir. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where we are your hosts. I cannot work out good for the podcast side of it. YouTube, though, you're really going to enjoy some of the theatrics. I'm Adam Arbrecht. I'm covering the Brooklyn Nets over on the Locked On Nets podcast with my boy Doug Norrie. And over there is the season generational ticket holder, healthy, wealthy, and wise, Mr. Andrew Makowitz.
I mean, we're closer to the Giants week 1 NFL season, and yet it feels like you have way more going on with the Nets than we do when we're in between mandatory minicamp and training camp, Adam.
I got to tell you, if the Giants would get on the same page, and I'm not saying it's healthy for your mental state or for your emotions or maybe your heart, but you got to dance a little, right? Tell me that maybe Saquon Barkley, Kadarius Toney, Daniel Jones, Brian Dable, and Joe Shane are all possibly getting traded this week. That's how you get a little bit of action in the offseason.
I mean, you really have a lot going on there, but I know that you still come back to your one true passion, which is talking Giants football.
Gosh, it's the pain that just keeps on growing inside of me. Friends, we had a little bit of fun there at the top. This is a extemporaneous conversation, tongue in cheek there, certainly at the introduction. But Baker Mayfield got traded. Baker Mayfield. He got traded, and it sparked this thought in my head. I'll start with the simple one of, should the New York Football Giants have been involved in these discussions? I'll allow you, Andy, to shoot that down.
Oh, that's what you wanted to say first and foremost? Should Baker Mayfield be involved? My short answer is no, he should not have been involved in the Baker Mayfield sweepstakes.
100%. And I want to get that one off the table here. Now, the Browns are going to eat $10.5 million of the contract for Baker Mayfield, and Baker Mayfield is going to restructure his deal with Carolina, going to reduce his, I think, salary down to about $5 million, can still get back to the total 18 and change of his contract with some incentives. And they also sent back a conditional 5th round pick. Now, 100%. There's no reason to go beyond the fact that any conversations around this now for the New York Football Giants wouldn't make any sense. They've committed to Daniel Jones this season. They've committed to entering the season with Saquon Barkley. They've committed to entering the season with Kadarius Toney, right? So many narratives that were happening around this team at the beginning of the offseason, and certainly as Joe Shane was first hired, and then Brian Dable and down the line. So in this moment, it would make no sense for the Giants to all of a sudden jump into this conversation, as low as the cost may have been. However, go ahead, Andy. What are you thinking?
Well, you have me thinking about a couple things. You said, should the Giants have been in the sweepstakes for Baker Mayfield? And my answer was no. And it's two or threefold. I'll give you the quick, short and sweet ones. I know you knocked it off the table, but first and foremost, we already have a quarterback that we're unsure of going into the final year of his deal, trying to figure out if we have something. Baker
100%.
Mayfield feels like it's the exact same thing. You'd be trading one problem for another. The other piece of it is Daniel Jones appears to be the consummate pro, where like he's in the building, he's working hard, and like by all accounts, everyone in the building loves him. Whereas Baker Mayfield has been polarizing with the fan base and the media and with some of his teammates like Odell Beckham. He's had a lot more controversy around him.
Well, yeah, and you can have that. I mean, listen, I think Odell has his own, if you're going to call it controversy, right? All these guys have it. I wouldn't. Daniel Jones has no blemishes on his personal or professional record, whereas though Baker may have some marks, I don't think it's anything seismic in that regard. But continue though.
I have two more for you that just came into my head as we talk about this. One is the measurables. It feels like for what Brian Dable and Mike Kafka want to do, they do want a quarterback that has mobility, that's a little bit taller, that has the big arm, has the nice arm strength, which Baker Mayfield is a little bit more diminutive in size. So like that's a whole nother piece of it. And the last thing is, with Baker Mayfield, does it solve any problem for the Giants that they have today? We mentioned like we're still trying to figure out what we have in Daniel Jones. Baker Mayfield isn't the slam dunk, so to have to give up draft capital, the conditional 4th round pick that the Carolina Panthers had to do.
5th round pick.
Well, conditional 5th round pick that turns into a 4th if Baker Mayfield gets enough playing time. I like how they always
everybody
do
would,
like the
right,
you
which
know
everyone
the
would want if it works out, right? Like it's
sure.
always the condition is always something positive for the team that's giving up the asset.
So yeah, so really the question is, if you could trade Daniel Jones for a conditional fifth round pick and bring in Baker Mayfield for a conditional fifth round pick, and the money was all the same, would you still feel the same? And my short answer after all that is, yes, I would.
That's not the question though. The question would be, and you're right though. Again, that's why again, this is I think this is fun. Have a little conversation, and in this moment right now, I would be nowhere near this. But what I wanted to get to was if this exact situation was unfolding, not after Joe Shane had been hired, but after Brian Dable had been hired, and now you have your head coach in place, and you know that you have a system that you're going to be operating. If at that time the Cleveland Browns were sending out the signals, hey, we will eat some money, which they didn't want to have to do on Baker Mayfield's contract, right? And hey, a conditional fifth round pick. If at the time that Brian Dable was hired, that was the price point before, all in the world of the multiverse of madness, and you hadn't committed to Tyrod Taylor yet, I 100% think that the Giants should have looked at bringing in Baker Mayfield. Because what would you be doing? You'd be saying, well, we're committed to Daniel Jones for the year. We're not picking up the fifth year option. So we're saying he has to go out and earn this job. And if he proves it, he's our guy. No problem. We move forward with him. Likewise, you're not committing anything to Baker Mayfield, but what you would walk in the door saying is Baker Mayfield, Daniel Jones, it's yours to take, right? Iron sharpens iron, as they say. Worst case scenario, and you would say this to Baker. Listen, if you lose out the starting job to Daniel Jones, but it's a healthy, deep competition, and you look good in preseason, and you're showcasing that you can still be a starting NFL quarterback, guess what? Market's open, baby. We'll wait for an injury around the league, and you'll be out the door. Same thing can be said to Daniel Jones, right? Hey, you want to be the franchise quarterback? Baker Mayfield is here to push you. You earn it, great, no problem. And at the end of the year, whatever the outcome, you'd be the exact same position that you're going to be at the end of this season with just Daniel Jones, in the exact same position if you had gotten rid of Daniel Jones. You'd be looking at the draft, comparing what you have on your roster to what could be coming out, and making a decision based off of that. So I find it fascinating from that standpoint. If this had been on the table then, and I'm not going to bat for Baker Mayfield as being, as being someone who can seismically shift your franchise or hasn't had ups and downs and both really good teams offensively around him in Cleveland and then a lot of chaos in that franchise, right? So I think I kind of come out of the wash indifferent to Baker Mayfield, but in this moment right now, I'm also indifferent to Daniel Jones, at least on paper.
Well, Adam, so the point that you bring up is the point that we had going into this free agent offseason. We both talked about Mitch Trubisky being a good option for the Giants going in. It's the
100%.
exact same feeling with Baker Mayfield, where it's like, hey, Mitch, you're coming in to compete with Daniel Jones. If Daniel Jones can't beat out Mitch Trubisky or Baker Mayfield, he's not our guy anyway,
Right.
because we've already seen that they are a bottom third quarterback in this league when they've been on the field potentially. Now, I think it would have been good competition. The Giants, once they kind of were spurred by Mitch going to Pittsburgh to have a better chance to outright start, they went and said, how can we make sure that if Daniel Jones falters, that we're still competitive on the field and we have a veteran leader behind him that we know we could turn to for a game or two, even if Daniel Jones gets hurt? That was the approach that the Giants had. But to your point, before Tyrod Taylor was in the mix and before Mitch had signed with Pittsburgh, it was like all indications were saying the Giants were making a push. They're going to give him a contract. And it just ended up, the only reason why he didn't come here from the reports is because he got a little bit more guaranteed money and he has a better opportunity to beat out people like Mason Rudolph in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and then they go and draft a rookie quarterback, but you still feel like, hey, maybe I get some run here. Maybe it's setting up for success. Yeah, and that's exactly like that's what I'm framing Baker Mayfield in. He's younger than Mitch, a little bit younger than Mitchell Trubisky. Maybe still has some theoretical upside. At this point of his career, he's younger than Tyrod Taylor. Tyrod, now again, to your point about I want a guy I don't have to worry about that's going to come in and do the role. Well, Tyrod Taylor doesn't bring up any issues there. Baker Mayfield, again, I tell you what I don't do is I don't fault Baker Mayfield when the Cleveland Browns go out and make that move for Deshaun Watson. We know what's unfolding around that right now and how messy that's going to get. I don't fault Baker Mayfield for very publicly stating, being like, I think we all agree that we don't want to be together anymore, right? Like, I don't want to be here. And you know that if the Browns, the only reason why they made this move is because they probably went back to Baker behind closed doors and said, now listen, in a world where maybe this new franchise quarterback is not going to be available for us, why don't you go ahead and earn that money and stay and play with us and fill the gap? And then maybe we'll try to move you whatever it was. And Baker, clearly, it's like, hey, listen, whatever I'm going to end up being, I'll go determine that future somewhere else. Here's an interesting thing in this conversation, because I pulled up over on StatMuse. Like, I was just like, where do these guys stack up, Daniel Jones and Baker Mayfield? And it is funny. Now, Baker, again, it's not apples to apples. There's been talent around Baker, certainly, and we can disseminate what has been good or bad around Daniel Jones or either side. But here's what I find so hilarious. They're within 1% of completion percentage in favor of Daniel Jones, by the way. Baker Mayfield is thrown for more average yards per completion and more yards per game, obviously. But the fascinating one to me was Baker Mayfield has played in 60 games, Daniel Jones 38. Baker has thrown 92 touchdowns, 56 interceptions, which is a really good ratio, right? For whatever he's not. And I think it's a really valid point when we talk about fit inside the system. He's not a mobile quarterback, right? He can scoot and scramble, but he's not a running quarterback in the sense of the Brian Dable or Mike Kafka system. 92 to 56, though. Daniel Jones is right now 45-29 on his split. Just double it, right? Double that number. 90 and 58. Like they are so, and this is maybe like, this is my way of coming back to this point of, you need not think that Baker Mayfield is a good quarterback. I don't really have too much of a weight on one side or the other, but I do look at Daniel Jones and sometimes these comparisons and go, and this is why at best I am an open opportunity on Daniel Jones and not willing to ever go the mile, understanding everything. I'm not going to go, well, if only for the offensive line and some of these things around him, this could have been. Nothing's ever perfect. And these guys are strikingly similar by the numbers.
You know, it is interesting because I have kind of always thought about their stats in comparison. They're very close in terms of their passer rating. I think Daniel Jones is an 84.5. Baker Mayfield's like an 87. So they're right within the margins. It's almost like Baker Mayfield is just a year or two ahead of what Daniel Jones has been in his career.
Right.
But the big I know that you don't like to give excuses, but the thing for me is the Cleveland offensive line was a top 5 offensive line for the last 3 or 4 years.
And the running game, and
the running game is the best two-headed monster in the entire league when you talk about Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb. When you talk about having Jarvis Landry, Odell Beckham, Donovan Peoples-Jones on the outside, as well as a guy like David Njoku, he has had enough talent around him where if you were to flip Baker Mayfield and Daniel Jones over the last couple of years, do we think that they would still have the same exact stats? My answer would be, I think Daniel Jones looked better. I don't think Baker Mayfield looks better behind a terrible Giants offensive line and all the injuries that the Giants had.
Yeah, that's the fascinating thing, right? If you drop Daniel Jones, you could do this with any quarterbacks, right? If you dropped, and we said this about Daniel Jones, if you dropped him in New England for the start of his career, what would he look like just from a coaching and stability standpoint? But I think, and I think you're right. Like, I don't know what Daniel Jones ultimately looks like if he starts his career at the same time that Baker does in Cleveland, and he's there for the ups and the downs, the ins and outs of wide receivers and everything that goes on there. But ton of talent, and maybe most importantly, you point to is the offensive line. So there would have been that stability in front of him. I think that you would see a shift in the positive direction. Now, I think would be fascinating too, though, is the thing that we can never quantify is, would Daniel Jones have been healthy over that stretch if he had been in Cleveland, right? That's always the big, that's as much of a factor around him as anything is, all the talent's there. But if you go to run and you get yourself crunched and all of a sudden they're talking about neck injuries, what would happen over 60 games if he had been there?
Okay, so I have a question that this Baker Mayfield and Daniel Jones situation brings up, and I want to get your feedback.
No, right?
To me, Adam, there's only about 8 quarterbacks, maybe conservatively, in the league that you kind of put them in any situation and they're going to do well. They will elevate the roster. They will elevate the team around them. The team will probably outperform because they'll carry them on their shoulders. You look at guys like Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes and Aaron Rodgers. Maybe you throw Russell Wilson into that mix. The list is short. It's not huge. Josh Allen may come to mind there. There's maybe 7 or 8 guys. Then you have a whole host of guys after that. The Dak Prescotts, the Kirk Cousins, the Derek Carrs that gets you to about, anywhere between 8 and 18, 19. And then you have the back half guys. If you have one of those back third guys that we mentioned, the Jared Goffs, the Baker Mayfields, the Daniel Jones, maybe even the Jameis Winstons, I don't know. The philosophy it's fascinating to me. Should the philosophy be build the team around them and see how far we can get? Or do you just continue to bottom out and hope that you can draft a top 8 quarterback? Like, if you
Yeah.
don't have one of those 8 guys, are you happy with Minnesota? Are you happy with the Raiders? Like, are you content being a fringe playoff team that maybe just can get hot and make a run? Or do you just strip it down to the studs and only like be happy until you get one of those top 8 guys?
And by the way, that's what we always talk about, right? And by most NFL accounts, yes, you are happy to build around the subpar quarterback by whatever metrics. And you mentioned Minnesota as the example. Kirk Cousins has made a killing in his career. And he's kind of a serviceable quarterback who can navigate the game for you. And by the way, I think we sometimes maybe, talk down about Kirk Cousins a little bit more than we should. You can compare his numbers to Baker Mayfield or Daniel Jones, and you would take Kirk Cousins 8 days a week, right? So there is that element to it. But he's not elevating anyone else's play. And it's the same thing you always used to talk about with a Tyrod Taylor when he was getting starting opportunities. What was it? He's not going to lose you the game. And that was a conscious decision on Tyrod Taylor's part. I am not that guy. How do I have longevity in this league in whatever iteration? By being a guy that doesn't F it up. I keep it clean. Now, listen, there's going to come a point in the game when you say, if you could just go for it here, we might win this one. Yeah, you're going to lose in the margin sometimes. But that's where I think some of these guys end up tearing themselves out. And maybe to Kirk Cousins' credit as the example, that dude will grip it and rip it sometimes. He's mostly a game manager, and then he'll try to bomb it out. And it usually doesn't go well, but he is willing to lean into that. That man does not lack for confidence. Oddly enough, with the other thing too, because you mentioned about how these guys have done in reverse opportunities. Baker Mayfield is only 30-30 as a starting NFL quarterback over those 60 games. Now Daniel Jones is 12-26. Again, we can compare the rosters and say what the value should have been, but that's like a fascinating one too, right? Baker, I don't. To your point, give me one of the top whatever 6 or 7 or 8 quarterbacks in the league, and the needle moves on the 38 games that Daniel Jones started for the New York Football Giants, right? From 12-26, maybe you get closer to 500, or there's a 5-game swing and you're talking about 17-19, right there, almost at 500. But if Baker Mayfield had been on the Giants, I don't think it has to be any worse, right? Doesn't the record doesn't be any worse, but I can't tell you it was going to be any better because there's been big sample sizes for Baker in terms of the areas where he struggles, right? There's some fundamentals that he has always struggled with. And ironically, again, it's kind of the same thing we're talking about. And we know we're poised as Giants fans are going to tell me in the comments. Again, this is meant to be a fun exercise and exploring and having like an NFL discussion. I know they're going to say, well, now that with the healthy offensive line and the weapons and everything else, Daniel Jones will be able to X. I believe he's capable of doing it. But I also think that he could get out there and show you some things that he doesn't do well, that he just is not necessarily equipped to do. Can he get better at it? Can he improve? Can he already have improved this offseason? 100%. But this is still that point where Baker Mayfield, plenty of years, and this is where I think if you are Cleveland, you're right to have moved on. I just wouldn't have done it by pursuing a guy like Deshaun Watson. I would have outright moved on from Baker at some point and traded him away for whatever the assets. He had his time, right? He has shown himself to be, at best, as the numbers tell you, on a pretty good team for all the variations of the Cleveland Browns, on a pretty good team, at above average team, let's put it that way. Baker Mayfield has shown he's a 500 quarterback. So you have to put him on a roster. He has to go to, I mean, heck, if he went to the Indianapolis Colts and you dropped him in there, I don't know, marginally better than 500, right? Like that's the standard that he's put out there.
Like the San Francisco 49ers could be another example of like, can you be slightly more available than Jimmy Garoppolo and maybe win
Great
10
example, right?
games? You know
Because
what I
for the
mean?
most part, Baker has been a guy who guts it out and plays, right? Has never played less than 14 games in his NFL career, right? So hey, I'm available. That I can give you that much. I can be there and hopefully perform at a functional level. That's the question about Daniel Jones. When you look at that record and you look at the health, is can you be available, and then can you be successful as this team is being improved?
Well, for the Giants, the way that they're doing it is smart. A lot of people wanted Malik Willis. There was discussions about what the Giants should do with the
Mhm.
5th or the 7th pick. Grab a quarterback. You got to grab a quarterback. Get a franchise guy if Daniel Jones isn't the guy. But what have we seen over the last couple of years? We've seen ready-made rosters and teams make big-time moves to get the quarterback that's the missing piece because
Mhm.
those quarterbacks want to go to that team. They envision themselves being there and saying, I can win with that talent around me. Look at Tampa Bay with Tom Brady. He goes there, immediately finds success after being a 500 team with Jameis Winston, right? Look at the LA Rams. Like Jared Goff got them so far. He got them to a Super Bowl, but they realized they were limited in what they could have. Matt Stafford looked at it and said, I could go to LA and I could win something, and did it. You look at Jimmy Garoppolo being out in San Francisco, like, I get dropped into this situation on a bad team, and all of a sudden we're headed to the playoffs and going to the Super Bowl.
Yep.
So, like, when you think about what the Giants are doing, there's different ways to do it, but you're seeing success around the league with just get as much talent as you can on this team. It may take a year or two more of a slow build, and then you pounce on getting your quarterback of the future, who may even be a Pro Bowler on a different team right now.
And that I think is, and we've talked about this before. And when it came around the draft, we speculated on all the possible quarterbacks and what they could do, and if they would take a shot. And mostly, we were talking about, hey, if you sneak back into the first round and grab one of these guys, right? But even if it's next year, the fundamental difference, I think that every team, like the Denver Broncos, right? And they go out and get Russell Wilson now. You talk about these other examples of Tampa Bay, of the LA Rams, right? The Green Bay Packers were right on the edge. And by the way, I think that's why they stuck it out with Aaron Rodgers, understanding what the abyss can look like without him. But if you are a bad team right now, like I'll even make the case that while Trevor Lawrence may turn this corner here in his second season, his rookie year was a disappointment, right? And they got coaching problems and all that other stuff. But he came out as highly touted as a quarterback prospect as we've had in recent memory, and he fell on his face in his rookie year. There was nothing to write home about. I can show you numbers that Daniel Jones has put up that were more impressive than that, right? And in that sense, to your point, if you are a bad team, put everything else in place. And then when a quarterback looks at your roster, when a Russell Wilson looks across the league, when Aaron Rodgers think about it, when Matthew Stafford is thinking about it, he's looking around and going, they've got everything I need. The only thing they need is me now, right? And then you can go to the market and you can sacrifice all the draft capital in the world to go get that guy and drop him in and hit the ground running. This is why I've said so for so long. Fundamentally, every time that they say you need a quarterback and that's why you got to take your shot in the draft, bullshit. You only have to take the shot if you think the quarterback is the quarterback in the draft. And even then, it doesn't matter because you're still setting yourself up for a 2, 3, or 4 year journey, which can be a good thing, and getting long-term franchise quarterbacks. But I'll be honest with you, man, being the team that puts all the pieces in place and then just kind of rotates through veteran guys that are established and want to go ahead and take a run, that probably gets you about a decade rotating through a handful of those quarterbacks of always being a playoff team and being exciting for your fan base. That's a formula that adds up. And those numbers come off the books pretty quick too.
Yeah. So the last thing I will say is we talked about Deshaun Watson. We talked about
Andy. At the end of the day, the
well,
last thing you'll say.
Well, the Deshaun Watson thing is a prime example of this as well, Adam. It's the next iteration of it. It seems like the final three teams that were in for Deshaun Watson's ability to play quarterback, if he ever gets on the field again, were the Carolina Panthers, the Atlanta Falcons, and the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah.
He's from the Atlanta area. He played at Clemson, which is close to Carolina, and he chose to go to Cleveland. Why? Even though they have a number one overall pick on their roster. Why did he do that? Because he looked at the talent all around and said, I will go past my childhood team. I will go past my college team. Give me the team that has the most talent available, and I'm going to go there to try to win.
And by the way, it's also an example when you mention those three teams to varying degrees. But Atlanta kind of they're falling on hard times right now potentially. Now they're rebooted. They got their quarterback. They think they kind of they're pivoting. But Carolina as well, and the Browns. The Browns have just like historically always seemed to do the wrong thing at the wrong time. There's also going after the wrong guy, right? If you're Cleveland and you want to go all in on Deshaun Watson, well, you should have been moving heaven and earth for Russell Wilson, right? Like you should have been. You got to go for the right guy to plug into your team. You can't go for the guy that looks like he's walking in the door with a ton of baggage and then say, boy, did we maybe step in it here, right? So that reputation follows teams around. And by the way, the circumstance right now for the New York Football Giants, they are at that turning point of trying to say, what has our reputation usually been? We are one of the stalwarts of the NFL. We are an organization that does things the right way. Over the last 7 to 10 years, it has been this team can't get out of its own way. They keep making missteps. And yeah, they're one of the stalwart franchises, but they have not carried themselves that way. And that's what they're hoping to turn the corner on here. And listen, I want it to be that Daniel Jones is the quarterback that ushers in that new era because, as you said at the top, he does everything right from a professionalism standpoint, a dedication standpoint, the way he talks to the media, right? He's there. He's grinding every morning. First one in, last one out. You hope that this is that turning point, and that when we reflect back on it, you go, yeah, this is why you don't get into those Baker Mayfield waters, because whatever happens in Carolina, I doubt that they're going to find themselves 2 or 3 or 4 years from now saying, we have Baker Mayfield, our franchise quarterback.
Couldn't agree more. This feels like a short-term thing. They hope Matt Corral's there in Carolina. This is exactly why I'm happy the Giants stayed away from the Baker Mayfield situation. Give Daniel Jones a legitimate shot. If he's not the guy, Tyrod can fill the gap until our first-round quarterback next year comes into the fold.
You see what we did there? We took you on a journey, friends. That's called an emotional ride from start to end, from beginning to finish. Swap that, scratch it and reverse it. We had a little bit of fun, and we think you're a little bit smarter for it. At the very least, we killed about 25 minutes for you on a Wednesday. We'll be back in talking more New York Football Giants as we head towards training camp. You know, you can get us on YouTube. You can find us over on the podcast wherever you get those needs fulfilled. And as Andy Mackowitz would want, need, and nay, demand you, the people, know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.